Hello and welcome back. Tonight we're climbing into a time machine built entirely out of magazine covers, and we're setting the dial for the year 1958, a year when the entire United States looked at the horizon and saw absolutely nothing but chrome. Rocket ships in the driveway, dinner in a capsule, a robot butler who never once asks for a raise. This was a country that had just watched the impossible become routine twice in a row, and it drew a straight, confident line from impossible to inevitable and never looked back. Spoiler, that line curved. Hard. Before we get into it, a genuine thank you to the person who requested tonight's topic in the comments. This channel exists because of suggestions like that one, so keep them coming. If you're enjoying the ride, a like and a subscribe helps enormously, though only if you mean it. And tell me down below where you're watching from and what time it is where you are, because it always seems to be far too late somewhere on this planet. If you'd rather just listen with your eyes closed, we're also on Spotify now, link in the description. Dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's go meet the people who were absolutely certain they knew what was coming. Ask yourself something before we begin. Did otherwise sensible adults truly believe their weekly grocery shop would be replaced by a single flavored tablet? Did they honestly picture a helicopter parked next to the rose bushes, as ordinary as a lawnmower? Did they really think that by the year 2000 the average person's biggest problem would be having too much free time on their hands? Yes, they did. And if all of that was supposedly right around the corner, why exactly are you still scrubbing a frying pan at midnight like it's 1850? Tonight we find out where it all went sideways. Congratulations, you've just opened your eyes in 1958, and every single person around you is walking around with the quiet, unshakable certainty that the best is yet to come. It's your first morning here, and the thing you'll notice before anything else is the temperature of the mood. It is warm. Almost uncomfortably warm. The fighting is over, the factories have switched from tanks to toasters, and there is a sense in the air that history has finally agreed to behave itself. Nobody around you seems to be bracing for disappointment. They are bracing, if anything, for delivery, for the truck to show up with the future already gift-wrapped. You, coming from a place where the future usually just means your app's updated overnight and now nothing works properly, will find this optimism almost physically strange, like walking into a room that's been heated 3 degrees too high. It's inescapable. It's on the cover of every glossy magazine, where an impossibly clean family gestures toward a skyline of buildings that do not yet exist and, frankly, never will. It's narrated in the newsreels by a man whose voice implies he has a standing lunch appointment with progress itself. It's baked into every advertisement, which no longer bothers selling you a product so much as a lifestyle your unborn grandchildren are apparently owed. The washing machine is a gateway to tomorrow. The new car is a leap into the age ahead. Even the floor polish, somehow, is revolutionary. You step outside and a neighbor mentions, casually, the way you'd mention it might rain later, that personal helicopters are coming within the decade. Nobody blinks. Doubting it would be a little like doubting Christmas. And here's the thing, their confidence isn't baseless, not entirely. These are people who have watched the impossible arrive on a fairly regular schedule. Radio became television. The airplane went from a novelty at the county fair to a genuinely useful way to cross an ocean. The atom itself got cracked open in a matter of years, and the whole architecture of the world rearranged itself accordingly. When you've watched your reality get upgraded twice inside a single adult lifetime, it stops sounding insane to assume the upgrades will simply keep coming, faster and grander forever. So they draw the line forward. If a washing machine exists today, then a washing machine that also folds the laundry is coming, and after that a machine that does the whole household without being asked, and after that, presumably, a machine that loves you back. Each rung looks perfectly reasonable when you're only looking at the rung directly below it. It's the same instinct that makes you assume that because your phone got a little smarter this year, it'll be reading your mind by next Christmas. The miscalculation isn't imagination. Imagination they had in generous supply. The miscalculation is assuming the road to that future is a smooth, well-lit boulevard instead of the chaotic, potholed, backwards-facing mess it actually turns out to be. Because the future does arrive, eventually, just not on time, not in the outfit anyone expected, and dragging along a suitcase full of complications nobody thought to RSVP for. The miracles, it turns out, are mostly real. It's the delivery schedule that was pure fiction, and there is no single miracle more beloved, more oversold, or more thoroughly humming underneath every other daydream of this era than the one we need to talk about first: the atom. Let's talk about the atom, because in 1958 it is about to personally solve every problem you've ever had. Electricity, they promise, is on the verge of becoming so cheap that metering it will feel like charging admission for sunlight. The scientists say it. The magazines say it. A very confident man on your black and white television, standing in front of a diagram that even he doesn't seem entirely sure how to explain, says it with total conviction. You'll stop paying a power bill altogether because who bills you for something as abundant as air? You will believe this completely, right up until the bill arrives anyway, on schedule, every single month forever. The atom is the wonder ingredient of the decade, and like every wonder ingredient before or since, the plan is to cram it into literally everything, whether it makes sense or not. There is enthusiastic talk of atomic-powered locomotives, atomic cargo ships, atomic aircraft that could theoretically circle the globe for months without landing. The logic feels airtight. A fingernail-sized pellet of fuel can outperform a mountain of coal, so why stop at the power station? It's the mid-century version of deciding that, because the internet turned out to be useful, your refrigerator obviously needs its own social media presence. The enthusiasm goes to some genuinely bizarre places. Serious engineers propose atomic home furnaces. Serious government scientists propose using small nuclear detonations to carve out new harbors and canals as a kind of industrial-scale landscaping tool. There's earnest discussion of a compact home reactor tucked in the basement next to the water heater, quietly doing its job the way a furnace does now. Picture it. Dad heading downstairs not to check the pilot light, but to check on the family reactor, the way you might top off a bird feeder. Nobody in the illustration seems terribly concerned about what this would do to the homeowner's insurance premium. Nobody, generally, seems concerned about much of anything, because concern is for pessimists, and pessimists have been asked to leave the building. The marketing leans into all of it. The atom gets a friendly cartoon face, part genius scientist, part genie, there to grant wishes rather than cause harm. Children's books present the atom as a cheerful pal. The word atomic gets stapled onto anything remotely modern for pure flavor. Science be damned, atomic breakfast cereal, atomic cocktails at the local lounge, an atomic hairstyle at the salon. It's branding, plain and simple, no different from the way everything today gets the word smart bolted onto the front of it until you own a smart doormat that needs a firmware update. Quietly, underneath all the cheer, a handful of more careful people already know the fuller picture. Nuclear power is real, and it is powerful, and it will genuinely light entire cities eventually. But it's also expensive, temperamental, and trailed by a list of consequences that never made it into any brochure. The promised era of metering optional electricity never comes. What arrives instead is power that is useful, costly, contentious, and you guessed it, still itemized down to the decimal point on a monthly bill. The genie turns out to be entirely real. He simply charges an hourly rate and has a noticeable temper. Even so, there's something almost admirable about the sheer audacity of it. An entire nation looked squarely at the single most terrifying force humanity had ever unleashed and decided, without flinching, that within a decade it would be quietly running the toaster for free. That isn't science. That's faith wearing a lab coat. And nowhere does that faith reach higher, or more literally. Then when 1958 turns its attention to the family car and decides, with total confidence, that its wheels are strictly temporary. Let's talk transportation and brace yourself, because the automobile is about to leave the road entirely. The consensus is total. By roughly the 1980s, the family sedan will lift gently off the driveway, retract its wheels, and glide you to the office above the gridlock like a very determined metal duck. No more red lights. No more waiting behind a delivery truck. Just you, an open sky, and around 40 million other households attempting to merge into the exact same patch of airspace at the exact same moment. Nobody in 1958 has really sat down and thought through what a four-car pileup looks like at 300 feet. And frankly, they'd rather not start now. This isn't some fringe daydream either. It's treated as the obvious next step for the automobile, as inevitable as next year's model getting slightly larger tail fins. Magazine covers show sleek, winged sedans rising above the rooftops, a delighted family waving down at the poor suckers still stuck bumper to bumper below. If you ask people what single invention they're most looking forward to, this is it, by a landslide. To this day, the flying car remains the platonic ideal of a broken promise. The one prediction everyone still brings up when they want to feel personally let down by the 20th century. Picture the commute the way the illustrators pictured it. You finish your coffee, kiss the family goodbye, stroll to the driveway, and simply rise, ascending over the hedge with the total, unearned confidence of a man who has apparently never once considered a crosswind. You cruise serenely above the suburbs, the whole neighborhood laid out below like a model railway set, and every single one of your neighbors is doing precisely the same thing at precisely the same time. The same neighbors, mind you, who can't back a sedan out of a driveway without clipping the mailbox. Here's the bit the fantasy conveniently skips. Getting something to fly isn't actually the hard part. Plenty of things fly. The hard part is putting several million distracted, undertrained, mildly caffeinated commuters into that same airspace simultaneously while they're fumbling with the radio dial. On a road, a lapse in attention means a scraped bumper and an awkward exchange of insurance information. In the air, that same lapse means you become an uninvited guest through someone's third-floor window. A fender bender becomes a falling object incident, and you are the falling object. Then there are the questions nobody in the illustration seems to want to raise. Where does a flying car go when it breaks down, which it will, constantly, because it's still a car? What does a flat tire look like at 400 feet? Who's directing all that traffic, and how confident are we in their coffee intake this morning? How much is too much to drink before piloting a personal aircraft directly over an elementary school? The answer offered by 1958 is a cheerful shrug and another glossy illustration of a smiling family sailing past a cloud. The engineering is treated as a rounding error, a detail the future will surely iron out somewhere off camera, in the part of the story nobody has to watch. The honest truth, which arrives slowly and without fanfare, is that the flying car never really failed on imagination. It failed on everything downstream of imagination: noise, cost, fuel, safety margins, and the very inconvenient requirement that every single driver on Earth suddenly become a competent pilot. So the dream gets quietly shelved, decade after decade, perpetually 20 years away and never any closer. But if the car refuses to leave the pavement, maybe, just maybe, the pavement itself can be talked into doing the actual work. And so the dream sinks back down to ground level and reappears as the self-driving highway. Can't quite manage the flying car budget yet. No matter, the road is about to start driving for you. Picture it. You steer onto the automated expressway, tap a single button, and lean back while embedded electronics guide your sedan along at a smooth, computer-managed pace. The whole family turns inward to play cards. Mom pours coffee. Dad lights his pipe. Nobody so much as glances at the windshield because the road, apparently, is a grown-up now and can be trusted completely. What could possibly go wrong at highway speed? while the entire car plays a board game. By the low standards of this particular era, it's actually one of the more grounded fantasies, which admittedly isn't saying much. The premise here is that the intelligence doesn't have to live inside every individual car. It can live in the road itself, threaded through with sensors and guide wires, while the car becomes little more than an obedient horse that already knows the way home. There really were demonstrations of this, sponsored by genuinely serious automakers, with test vehicles trundling along a fixed track guided by buried cables, drivers grinning and waving both hands in the air like kids on a roller coaster. The advertisements lean hard into the leisure angle. The car of tomorrow becomes a cozy little parlor on wheels, seats swiveled to face one another, a small fold-out table, the family playing cards or reading the newspaper while the entire highway slides past, unwatched, outside the glass. The tedious business of steering, watching, braking, the whole tiresome chore of actually driving, gets handed off entirely to the machine. You become a passenger inside your own commute. You almost have to give them credit here, because they weren't entirely wrong, just early, by a genuinely embarrassing margin, and pointed at the wrong half of the equation. The self-driving car does eventually show up in your century. It just turns out the intelligence ended up living inside the vehicle instead of the road, and everyone involved is still keeping one nervous hand hovering near the wheel just in case. Because trusting a machine to handle something this important turns out to take a great deal longer to earn than any magazine cover ever suggested. What 1958 conveniently glosses over, as always, is the enormous gap between a tidy demonstration on a closed test track and the genuine bedlam of an actual American highway. On the test track, one car, one cable, one beaming engineer, and flawless weather. On the real road, rain, fog, a startled deer, a mattress that's fallen off someone's truck, a child chasing a ball into the street, and 10,000 other cars, each one making its own small human mistake in real time. The board game commute assumes the world is a laboratory. The world, stubbornly, has never once agreed to that arrangement. But the dream of hands-free motoring doesn't stop at steering. If the highway can handle the driving, the reasoning goes, why should the engine keep relying on something as crude as gasoline? And that question, naturally, leads straight back to the miracle ingredient of the age, delivering us to the entirely serious 1958 proposal for a sedan powered by its own personal nuclear reactor. Let's aim a little higher, because gasoline apparently is strictly for cavemen. The automobile of tomorrow will carry its own compact nuclear reactor where the trunk used to be, drive several thousand miles, swing by the service station, swap out a glowing fuel core the way you'd swap a battery, and keep going. There really is a full concept car built around exactly this premise. Designers thrilled about the styling, the tail fins, the dashboard, the sheer forward-thinking hum of it all. The one detail they've quietly tabled for a later conversation is what happens to all of this in a fender bender. The pitch is genuinely seductive, provided you don't think about it for more than about 4 seconds. No more gas station stops, no more oil changes, a single, tiny charge of atomic fuel lasting years at a time. You simply drive and drive and drive, and never once think about energy as something you have to manage. It's the same atomic everything instinct that gave the era its atomic toasters and basement reactors, now applied to the single most beloved object in American life. If the atom can light up an entire city, surely it can push around one sedan, and surely it will look fantastic doing it. And credit where it's due, the styling really is gorgeous, sweeping lines, confident chrome, the reactor housing disguised as just another elegant design flourish, because that's always where the genuine creative effort goes. The dream gets rendered in loving, obsessive detail right up to the surface. The fins, the paint, the smiling driver behind the wheel, and then stops dead exactly at the surface, because the surface is the part you can paint. Everything underneath is the part somebody would actually have to solve. So let's lift the hood, gently, on the part they skipped. A functioning reactor needs serious shielding to keep the people sitting 3 feet away from being quietly cooked over the course of a commute. Shielding of that magnitude is, by definition, extremely heavy enough that an atomic car built to genuinely protect its passengers would weigh in somewhere around a small building, at which point it stopped being a car and started being a monument. And that's before anyone works up the nerve to ask the truly uncomfortable question. What happens when this rolling reactor meets a telephone pole, or another atomic car, or a 16-year-old on their very first solo drive? The fender-bender problem isn't a footnote here. It's the whole ballgame. A regular collision ruins your afternoon. An atomic collision in the genuinely bad scenarios ruins the whole neighborhood's decade. Multiply that risk across an entire nation of distracted drivers, crowded parking lots, and fast food drive-thrus, and that cheerful glowing fuel core starts looking a great deal less like the future and a great deal more like handing every household a portable catastrophe, along with a set of keys. It's the sort of idea that can only survive in a world that's already decided in advance that nothing could possibly go wrong. So the atomic sedan stays exactly where it belongs, a beautiful model rotating slowly on a showroom turntable, endlessly photographed, and very wisely never actually built. But the dream of effortless, boundless personal power doesn't die there. It simply climbs out of the car and starts looking for somewhere new to land, and it finds it strapped directly to a person's back. Forget the automobile altogether, because the truly forward-thinking commuter of tomorrow doesn't drive to work, they wear their vehicle. Strap on a rocket belt, give a determined little crouch, and launch yourself clean over the hedge, across the block, and gently down onto the office lawn. This is presented with a completely straight face, roughly the way you might describe catching the morning bus. Nobody in the illustration seems especially bothered by the fact that you are now, functionally, a soft human being riding a controlled explosion above a crowded parking lot, briefcase in hand. The assumption is simply that by tomorrow, everyone will be doing exactly this, your boss included, and that the landing somehow will be the easy part. It never is. The jetpack might be the single purest expression of this era's entire worldview, which boils down to: any problem can be solved with more thrust and considerably less caution. Why bother building infrastructure when you could simply fire the individual citizen bodily through the air instead? The illustrations are magnificent. A businessman in a full suit soars serenely above the rooftops, hat somehow still perfectly in place, the very picture of composed efficiency. He is never screaming in the picture. In reality, there would be an enormous amount of screaming. And here's the genuinely funny twist: the rocket belt actually does get built. It's real. It works more or less at demonstrations and public fairs, and in one especially famous appearance, a man genuinely lifts off the ground and completes a short hop through the air to a roaring, delighted crowd. For one glorious moment, the future appears to have arrived exactly on schedule. The newspapers swoon. Surely, everyone assumes, the personal flying machine has arrived, and the daily commute is about to become a literal launch. Then the fine print drifts back down to earth. The rocket belt burns through its entire fuel supply in roughly the time it takes to read this sentence out loud. A full flight lasts somewhere around 20 seconds before you're out of thrust, and quite literally out of luck, which makes for a thrilling ride only if your office happens to be directly across the street and you're not fussy about sticking the landing. The thing is deafening. The exhaust will happily scorch your legs. And the margin for pilot error sits at approximately 0, because the ground, famously, does not negotiate. This is the recurring heartbreak of the whole atomic age fantasy. The flashy demonstration works just well enough to convince absolutely everybody, while the boring practical reality, fuel capacity, safety, the small matter of not roasting your own calves quietly refuses to cooperate. A jetpack that flies for 20 seconds is a phenomenal party trick and a genuinely useless way to get to work. You cannot build a civilization around 20 seconds of controlled flight and a prayer, however striking it looks in a photograph. So the jetpack joins the flying car and the atomic sedan in the great museum of magnificent things that came agonizingly, briefly close to being real. And when the sky won't cooperate, the dream simply drops back to ground level and decides that if it can't put you in the air, it can at least spare you the unbearable indignity of walking. The sidewalk, apparently, is about to start doing the work for you. Picture the city of tomorrow, except you won't actually be strolling through it, because walking is scheduled for retirement. The sidewalks of the future move on their own, sweeping pedestrians along the way. An airport conveyor belt handles luggage, so that no citizen ever again has to waste precious energy on the genuinely ancient chore of putting one foot in front of the other. For longer trips across town, you'll be tucked into a pneumatic capsule and whooshed through underground tubes like an especially cheerful piece of mail. The city planners are thrilled. Nobody has quite gotten around to asking what happens if two of these tubes meet, or what becomes of a passenger's hat along the way. The moving sidewalk is one of those ideas that sounds brilliant right up until you actually picture yourself using it. The full vision imagines a city laced end to end with conveyor belts running in every direction, the entire population standing perfectly still while the ground does the hurrying on their behalf. Some versions get genuinely ambitious, with multiple belts running side by side at different speeds, so a rider could step from a slow lane to a faster one to an even faster one, accelerating across town like a parcel headed for dispatch. It's pitched as the pinnacle of civilized convenience. Nobody in the illustration seems to be picturing the elderly gentleman attempting that lane change and being launched with real velocity into a nearby flower bed. There's something almost touching about the underlying philosophy, that walking, a completely free technology that has served humanity reliably for a couple of million years, is somehow the piece of daily life most urgently in need of fixing. The future, as imagined here, finds ordinary human effort distasteful on principle. Better to stand still and be transported, letting the machine shoulder the entire burden of getting from one place to another while you simply exist and glide. It's the exact same impulse that, in your century, produces a fully grown adult riding an electric scooter down a flat sidewalk they could easily have walked in under 2 minutes. Then there's the pneumatic tube, where the city of tomorrow truly loses its composure. The idea is borrowed wholesale from the little canisters that shoot cash and paperwork around department stores and office buildings, those satisfying tubes that vanish with a soft thunk. The bright idea here is to scale the whole system up to human size, climb into a capsule, get sucked through a network of pipes by sheer air pressure, and pop out somewhere across town moments later, slightly rumpled but on time. It's fast. It's direct, and it treats every citizen as a piece of mail to be delivered, which is somehow both remarkably efficient and thoroughly undignified. And as ever, the obvious questions go conveniently unasked. What happens if the power cuts out while you're wedged halfway through a tube beneath the city, alone in the dark like a forgotten parcel? What happens if two capsules get routed toward each other down the same pipe, each one carrying a passenger who assumed today would be perfectly ordinary? What happens to a moving sidewalk when it jams, which it inevitably will, stranding a quarter-mile of commuters standing motionless on an extremely expensive broken floor, contemplating the radical, forgotten option of simply walking? These, as ever, are tomorrow's problems, and tomorrow, you'll recall, is supposed to be flawless. The deep irony that 1958 simply cannot see coming is that its city of the future pours enormous ingenuity into abolishing the one form of movement that turns out to be genuinely good for the human body. Your century will eventually rediscover walking and sell it right back to people as wellness, as exercise, as 10,000 steps dutifully counted by a little device strapped to the wrist. The conveyor belt city imagined a paradise of total stillness. The actual future decided stillness was the problem all along. But before we leave the gleaming streets behind, we need to step indoors, into the single most fussed over, most heavily automated, most aggressively button-covered room in the entire house of tomorrow. It's time to walk into the kitchen. Step into the kitchen of the future, the true crown jewel of the home exhibition, where cooking is finally about to become something that simply happens to you rather than something you do. Every countertop gleams. Every task hides behind one satisfying button. Press one and dinner materializes. Press another and the dishes vanish into the wall to be cleaned by forces you don't fully understand and honestly don't want explained. Supposedly, the entire room can be hosed down at the end of the night, the way you'd rinse out the inside of a swimming pool. It is spotless. It is effortless. And it apparently requires somewhere in the neighborhood of 90 separate buttons, of which any given household will remember how to use roughly 4. The kitchen of tomorrow is the undisputed centerpiece of every Home of the Future exhibition, the one room that draws the longest lines, because it's where the era's promises feel the most personal. The pitch is liberation, plain and simple. Cooking is tedious. Cleaning is worse. And the future intends to make both of them vanish behind smooth panels and glowing dials. Cabinets rise and lower at the flip of a switch so nobody ever has to stretch for a top shelf again. Appliances pop up out of the countertop when summoned and retreat out of sight the second they're finished. The whole room performs like a magic trick, with the homemaker cast as the smiling magician who merely has to gesture. The just hose it down fantasy deserves special recognition for sheer, unfiltered optimism. The premise is that every surface, every appliance, every corner of the future kitchen will be so thoroughly sealed and waterproofed that, at the end of a long day, you can simply spray the entire room down, let the water drain away through a floor grate, and walk out leaving a sparkling chamber behind you. It's presented as the ultimate convenience. It also quietly assumes you're comfortable with your kitchen operating on the same basic principle as a car wash, and that live electrical wiring and a daily indoor flood make perfectly natural companions, which is, generously speaking, an optimistic assumption. What quietly gives the whole fantasy away, as it so often does, is exactly who's standing in the illustration. The push-button kitchen is marketed almost exclusively to the woman of the house, on the explicit promise that it will finally set her free. And yet in every single picture, she's the one still standing in the kitchen, pressing the buttons. The future has automated the physical labor without ever once questioning whose labor it actually was to begin with. It will happily invent a robot to wash the dishes before it ever imagines a world in which someone else in the household might reasonably be expected to help. The technology sprints 100 years into the future, while the underlying assumptions stay parked firmly in the driveway, and meanwhile the buttons just keep multiplying, with seemingly no upper limit, every single function earning its own dedicated dial, its own indicator light, until the kitchen of tomorrow resembles the cockpit of an airliner operated by someone who only wanted to make a piece of toast. There's a genuine, almost profound failure here to grasp that more buttons is not the same thing as more convenience, that a machine with a dedicated control for absolutely everything is, functionally, a machine that nobody can actually operate. It's the direct ancestor of every appliance sitting in your kitchen right now with 30 different settings, exactly one of which ever gets used forever. The truth hiding underneath all that chrome is that convenience isn't the same thing as ease, and automating a chore is not the same thing as understanding it. The future kitchen could summon dinner at the press of a button in theory. What it could never do was tell you what to actually make, or why the family was sick of the same 3 meals, or how to comfort a tired child with a properly made grilled cheese sandwich. It solved the muscle memory of the work and missed the heart of it completely. Still, all that button pressing leaves one job conspicuously unassigned: the fetching, the carrying, the general tidying that not even the smartest kitchen can manage entirely on its own. For that, the home of tomorrow has something considerably more exciting waiting in the wings. It has a robot. Meet the household robot, because apparently no home of the future is complete without a tireless mechanical servant gliding around the living room. And the future has decided, with total confidence, that servant will be a she. She'll vacuum, dust, serve drinks, keep an eye on the children, and never once file a single complaint. The advertisements show her rolling smoothly across the floor on a single wheel, balancing a full tray of cocktails without spilling a drop. What the advertisements very carefully do not show is this same robot attempting a staircase. The future, it turns out, has quietly agreed never to mention the stairs. This robot will apparently conquer atomic energy and interplanetary travel long before it ever figures out how to climb one ordinary flight of steps. The Robot Maid is the dream of effortless living made metal, and she is genuinely everywhere in the imagined future. A friendly domed head, an unfailingly pleasant disposition, and an apparently bottomless willingness to handle every household task nobody else wants. She's the answer to precisely the same problem the push-button kitchen was already meant to solve, except now the labor isn't just hidden behind sleek panels. It's handed off entirely to a tireless servant who exists purely to liberate the family from the burden of maintaining their own home. It's a genuinely lovely fantasy. It's also a strangely revealing one, because look closely at what the robot is actually for. This era can imagine astonishing machines in every direction, and then, with remarkable consistency, points almost all of them straight at the household chores. The same civilization dreaming of moon colonies dreams with equal intensity of a machine that will, at long last, handle the dusting. There's something almost touching about it. For all the rockets and reactors, the deepest fantasy of this entire era turns out to be something as small as never having to tidy up after yourself again. And the exact shape the robot takes tells you everything you need to know about the era that dreamed her up. She's specifically a maid, a mechanical stand-in for domestic labor, which means this era could far more easily imagine a thinking, moving, fully autonomous machine than it could imagine the household simply running differently. The robot doesn't change who does the work, in spirit. It just swaps a person out for an appliance and calls the whole arrangement progress. The imagination soars all the way to the stars and lands, every single time, right back in the same living room, serving the same tray of drinks, just with a smiling robot doing the serving now instead. Which brings us back inevitably to those stairs, because that's exactly where the entire dream trips and tumbles down a flight. The advertised robot glides along beautifully on the flat, perfectly content, rolling like a very determined bowling ball, but nobody illustrates what happens the moment she reaches a staircase, because the honest answer is nothing good. It turns out the things human beings find effortlessly, almost insultingly easy, walking across an uneven lawn, climbing a flight of stairs, picking a dropped sock up off the floor, telling a cat apart from a footstool, are exactly the things machines find nearly impossible. This era got the whole equation backward, and that's the quiet joke buried inside the entire robot fantasy. Your century does eventually build a household robot after a fashion. It's a flat disc that scoots around the floor, gently bumping into the furniture, and it absolutely cannot handle a staircase, exactly as nobody in 1958 accidentally predicted. The grand mechanical butler with the tray of drinks never shows up. What shows up instead is a confused little puck that regularly gets stuck under the couch and needs to be personally rescued. With the cooking automated and the cleaning theoretically robotized, the home of tomorrow turns its attention, finally, to the one remaining task it apparently cannot quite abolish, the small business of actually eating, which it fully intends to ruin. It's time for the meal of tomorrow, and you should adjust your expectations accordingly, because dinner is about to fit comfortably on a teaspoon. The promise is bold. Before long, an entire roast dinner's worth of nutrition will be compressed into a single pill or a neat little nutritious cube. No cooking, no chewing, no washing up. No joy particularly, but no washing up either. You'll swallow the equivalent of a full Thanksgiving spread and simply carry on with your day. Everyone in 1958 finds this thrilling. possibly because nobody has quite connected the dots between this glorious convenience and the slow, dawning realization that they will never again taste an actual mashed potato. The meal in a pill is one of the oldest and most stubbornly recurring predictions there is, older even than this particular era, and it simply refuses to die, no matter how many times reality politely declines the invitation. The appeal is obvious in a world obsessed with efficiency. Eating takes real effort. You have to shop for it, prepare it, cook it, sit through it, chew it, and then clean up afterward, and that's all time you could otherwise be spending gliding down a moving sidewalk on your way to strap into a jetpack. So the future proposes eliminating the whole production and replacing it with one single swallow, the exact same instinct that tried to abolish walking, driving, and household cleaning. It's genuinely worth sitting with how bleak this vision actually becomes once the initial novelty wears off. Food isn't merely fuel. It's flavor, warmth, ritual, comfort, the smell of something cooking, the gathering of people around a shared table, the small daily pleasure of a meal you've genuinely been looking forward to. The pill strips every bit of that away and leaves nothing behind but raw chemistry, the bare nutritional minimum, delivered with all the romance of taking a daily vitamin. It's a bit like replacing every song you've ever loved with a printed list of its individual notes, technically complete, spiritually bankrupt. And here's the assumption hiding quietly underneath the whole fantasy, the one that should have given everybody pause. The meal in a pill treats eating as a chore to be engineered away, rather than a pleasure worth actively protecting. That's the exact same instinct running underneath this entire imagined future. The conviction that the whole point of progress is to strip every last scrap of effort out of human life, until nothing remains except the enjoyment of a resulting emptiness. Nobody ever pauses to consider whether some of that effort might, in fact, be the point. Whether a life with every task removed is really a life worth swallowing in tablet form. The chemistry, for what it's worth, never quite cooperates anyway. The sheer volume of energy a human body needs to get through an ordinary day simply cannot be folded down into a single tablet. Attempt the math honestly, and the calories alone demand a pill roughly the size of a brick, at which point you haven't invented the meal of tomorrow at all. You've just invented an unusually inconvenient loaf of bread. The human body is needy and bulky and stubbornly analog, and it insists on receiving its dinner in dinner form, in quantities no amount of magazine optimism can compress onto a teaspoon. Biology, unlike an illustrator on a deadline, cannot be talked into anything. So the meal in a pill stays exactly where it's always lived, in the realm of the cheerfully upcoming, forever about to arrive, and never once actually showing up to supper. Your century keeps a faint echo of the dream alive anyway. The meal replacement shake, the nutrition bar gulped down at a desk between meetings, the sad little gestures toward turning food back into pure efficiency. And every one of them is quietly haunted by the knowledge that, deep down, nobody actually wants this. People want the roast. People have always wanted the roast. But the future isn't finished meddling with your plate just yet, because if it can't shrink your dinner down to a pill, it has an entirely different plan. One that involves looking out at the vast, hungry ocean and deciding that's exactly where supper ought to come from instead. Let's stay hungry a little longer, because the future has big plans for your plate, and most of those plans involve the sea. With the population climbing steadily, the experts of 1958 announced that tomorrow's dinner is going to be farmed straight out of the ocean. You'll dine on pressed plankton cakes, algae loaf, and protein scraped directly from the water itself, all rebranded with cheerful, appetizing names specifically designed to help you forget what you're actually eating. There are glossy illustrations of happy families tucking into neat green bricks of pressed seaweed, beaming the way only a magazine family can beam. You are assured this is delicious. You are assured this is the future. In 1958, you are assured of a great many things. The reasoning, for once, isn't entirely unreasonable. The The thinkers of the era look at the population curve heading steadily upward and run the arithmetic. And the arithmetic suggests there will eventually be an awful lot of hungry mouths and only so much usable farmland to go around. So they turn, logically enough, toward the enormous untapped pantry covering roughly 70% of the planet, the ocean. The sea is vast. The sea is teeming with life. And the sea, crucially, doesn't need to be plowed. Surely the thinking goes. The solution to feeding billions of people is floating right there in the water, simply waiting to be harvested and pressed into a loaf. So the future menu takes shape, and it's a decidedly green affair. Algae, humble pond scum, essentially, gets promoted to the role of miracle food, dried and pressed and reshaped into biscuits, patties, and slabs of nutritious paste. Plankton, the tiny drifting organism sitting at the very bottom of the food chain, gets recruited straight to the top of the dinner table. The illustrations show it all served proudly on fine china under warm golden lighting. A beaming family gathered around as if seaweed brick were a cherished holiday tradition stretching back generations, rather than something a committee dreamed up the previous Tuesday. The Naming, notice, is doing an enormous amount of quiet work here. Nobody particularly wants to sit down to a steaming plate of algae, so the algae becomes a steak. Nobody's mouth waters at the thought of plankton, so plankton gets a friendly brand name and a cheerful color scheme. This is one of the oldest tricks in existence, dressing the unfamiliar up in the costume of the familiar, and your own century knows it intimately. Every single time a food built in a laboratory gets handed the name of a food grown on a farm, every time something faintly unsettling and green gets promised to taste just like chicken, you're hearing the direct descendant of that plankton steak, still wearing its original disguise. What the cheerful family illustration conveniently skips over is the small matter of whether anybody genuinely enjoys eating any of this. You can press seaweed into whatever attractive shape you like. It remains, stubbornly, seaweed. The future tends to assume people will happily eat whatever is efficient and nutritious, as though taste were merely a minor inconvenience to be smoothed over with clever marketing. But people are not so easily managed at the dinner table. They're picky. They're sentimental. They're devoted, sometimes irrationally, to flavor, and they will go to genuinely impressive lengths to avoid a brick of processed pond scum, regardless of how many vitamins it contains or how beautifully it's been photographed. The strange part is how partly right they actually turn out to be, in the quiet, unglamorous way the future so often is. Your century really does farm the sea. It really does eat the algae. It really does scrape protein out of surprising places and quietly fold it into the food supply, usually without announcing it too loudly. The seaweed snack exists on your grocery store shelf right now. The algae supplement exists in your vitamin aisle. The future did arrive green and faintly fishy, just without the beaming family pretending the whole thing was a feast. But while the future was busy reinventing what ends up on your plate, it was equally busy reinventing the very structure the plate sits inside. The house itself, which it had decided ought to be made entirely of plastic and shaped, more or less, like a flying saucer. Let's go house hunting, because the home of tomorrow is built entirely from plastic and shaped like something that landed, rather than something that was actually constructed. 4 curved wings hover above the ground on a single central stem. Every wall is molded synthetic material, and the whole structure looks considerably less like a house, and rather more like an extremely confident kitchen appliance. There really was a full-scale version of this built as a public attraction, and crowds line up eagerly to marvel at its plastic chairs, its plastic sink, its plastic everything. The vision on offer is that your grandchildren will all be living inside one of these. The reality, decades later, is that when someone finally tries to tear one down, the wrecking ball simply bounces off. Plastic is the wonder material of this particular moment, and just like the atom before it, the plan is to make absolutely everything out of it. It's cheap. It's endlessly moldable. It's modern. It never rots, never rusts, and never needs a fresh coat of paint. To a society thoroughly in love with novelty, plastic isn't merely a material, it's practically a philosophy. So why bother building a house out of tired old wood and brick, the same materials your grandparents used, when you could instead mold an entire home out of smooth synthetic curves, gleaming and seamless, wiped clean with a single damp cloth and apparently immune to the passage of time? The house of tomorrow is plastic from the doorknob straight up to the roofline. Its shape is the real giveaway. That hovering, four-winged saucer perched on its central pillar like some kind of mushroom transplanted from another planet entirely, deliberately built to resemble nothing that came before it, announcing at a single glance that the people living inside have escaped the dreary past for good. There's a genuine walk-through version of it, and the public adores it, filing past the molded furniture and the sleek fittings, picturing an entire future lined street after street with these same gleaming pods. It's bold, it's strange, and it commits itself, completely and without irony, to the idea that the future will actually look like the future. What nobody quite reckons with is plastic's personality over the long haul. The stuff that seemed so clean and so permanent turns out to have opinions of its own. It yellows steadily in the sun. It grows brittle with age. It is absolutely wonderful at being shaped into anything you like, and absolutely terrible at ever being gotten rid of again. And that's precisely the part that comes back to haunt everyone downstream. The house built to last forever does, in a sense, actually last forever, except nobody genuinely wants it to anymore. It simply sits there, stubbornly refusing to decompose, a strange, immortal monument to a future that quietly changed its mind about the whole idea. And there's a deeper problem the gleaming attraction never quite raises, which is that people don't really want to live inside an appliance. A home isn't just shelter, it's comfort, character, all the small imperfections that make a particular place unmistakably yours. The molded plastic pod, identical to every other molded plastic pod lining the same street, offers efficiency and hygiene and a genuinely striking vision of tomorrow, but somewhere along the way it forgets to offer warmth. It's the architectural cousin of the meal in a pill, technically a home, spiritually more of a waiting room. People kept quietly choosing the fussy old house with the creaky staircase instead, and they kept choosing it for a reason. The entire plastic dream rests on a kind of faith that newer is inherently, automatically better, that a material with absolutely no past must be the material of the future. Your century inherits the full consequences of that faith, in the form of a planet generously decorated, from the deepest ocean trench to the highest mountain, with plastic that has thoroughly outlived everyone who ever doubted it would. But the future's love affair with the disposable didn't stop at the walls of the house. It reached, with genuinely startling ambition, all the way to the clothes on your back. Let's talk about laundry, or rather, about laundry's glorious upcoming extinction. In the future, nothing gets washed because nothing is meant to be kept. Your clothing will be made from a cheap paper-like material, worn exactly once, then crumpled up and tossed away like a used napkin. Same story for the plates, the cups, the curtains, quite possibly the furniture too. Why bother cleaning anything at all when you can simply discard it and summon a fresh one? It sounds wonderfully carefree right up, until you picture the actual mountain of discarded paper dresses steadily piling up behind every single home in America. 1958 has not thought seriously about that mountain. 1958, quite frankly, does not want to think about that mountain. The mountain, unfortunately, is extremely patient. The disposable dream is this era's love affair with convenience, taken to its natural, slightly unhinged conclusion. If washing dishes is a chore, then simply abolish dishes. Eat off something you can throw away and never scrub a plate again. If laundry is a burden, abolish laundry, wear something exactly once and bin it. This is a future that has no interest in maintaining anything, because maintenance requires effort, and effort, as we've established repeatedly by now, is the enemy. So the grand plan is to swap out the entire exhausting business of keeping things clean for the considerably more carefree act of simply throwing things out and starting fresh every single morning. The paper dress becomes the strange little celebrity of this whole fantasy, and for one brief moment it genuinely exists, sold as a novelty item, a frock you wear once to a party and discard on the way out the door. The illustrations promise an entire wardrobe built along these lines, a closet you never once wash, because you simply restock it, curtains you peel down and swap for new ones, furniture cheap and light enough to set out with the weekly trash the moment you get tired of it. The entire home becomes something you use up and continually renew, the exact way you'd work through a roll of paper towels. And honestly, the appeal is real. You can feel it even now, that fantasy of never having to maintain anything ever again. No scrubbing, no mending, no stains to pre-treat. But the dream has a back door, and behind that back door sits the mountain. Everything disposable has to go somewhere once it's been disposed of, and a society that's throwing away its clothes, its dinnerware, its curtains, and quite possibly its furniture on a daily basis, is a society steadily generating an unimaginable heap of yesterday. The future happily pictures the crisp, fresh dress waiting each morning. It very carefully never pictures the accumulated pile of every previous morning stacked up behind it. This is the blind spot running underneath the entire convenient tomorrow, the comfortable assumption that away is a genuine place, and that things thrown out simply vanish rather than steadily accumulate somewhere just out of frame. Your century knows exactly where away turns out to be, because you live directly downstream of it, surrounded by the very patient mountain that 1958 politely declined to imagine. The disposable future did arrive in its own way, not as paper dresses exactly, but as a genuine deluge of packaging and single-use everything. And the bill for all that carefree convenience eventually came due, with substantial interest. The deepest irony is that an era so completely in love with newness never once stopped to consider the actual cost of constant renewal, never asked what happens to a world where nothing is built to last and everything is built to be replaced. The dream of disposable everything really was a dream of freedom from drudgery, and drudgery genuinely is tiresome. The dream wasn't wrong about that. It was only ever wrong about the trade. But while the future busied itself making the small things disposable, it was quietly setting its sights on something far more ambitious to control, something it genuinely had no business believing it could manage at all. It was about to seize command of the sky itself and start ordering the weather like a takeout dinner. Let's talk about the weather, which in the future you will apparently order the way you'd order room service. Tired of the rain? Cancel it. Want a picturesque snowfall for the holidays? Schedule it in advance. The grand plan goes further still, sealing entire cities beneath enormous transparent domes where the temperature stays locked at a perfect, permanent 72 degrees and wind becomes something your grandparents used to complain about. No umbrellas, no slush, no sunburn. Just one long, uninterrupted, pleasant afternoon under glass, forever. The engineers seem entirely confident this is coming. They're considerably less confident about how, exactly, one cleans the outside of a dome the size of an entire city, or what happens the first time a passing bird develops strong opinions about it. The ambition on display here is genuinely breathtaking, in the most literal sense, because this era has decided that whether that ancient, famously untamable force is really just one more inconvenience awaiting a sufficiently clever technical fix. The reasoning flows naturally out of everything else this era already believes. If you can split the atom and completely reinvent the household and farm an entire ocean for dinner, then surely the clouds themselves are next on the list. Just one more stubborn system waiting to be brought politely to heel. The dream here is total mastery, a world where rain falls strictly on schedule, storms get politely canceled outright, and the climate becomes just one more household appliance with a dial mounted conveniently on the front. The glass dome represents the grandest version of this entire fantasy, The idea of lifting a whole city bodily out of the messy, unpredictable outdoors and tucking it neatly under one enormous transparent lid. Inside, perpetual springtime. No coats, no shoveling, no ruined picnics. Just one permanent, gentle afternoon, carefully maintained by machinery, with the entire population strolling around in shirt sleeves in the dead of a genuine winter. It's the climate-controlled kitchen, scaled up to swallow an entire metropolis, and it rests on precisely the same comforting belief running throughout this whole era, that any discomfort at all can be engineered out of existence, provided you're willing to build a big enough machine and seal yourself safely inside it. What the dome dream conveniently overlooks is the sheer, almost comical impracticality of the thing the moment you actually poke at it. A transparent roof stretched over an entire city would require regular cleaning, and there is no squeegee in existence built for that particular job. So the citizens of tomorrow would spend their perfectly pleasant afternoons gazing upward through an accumulating layer of grime, bird droppings, and the very weather they thought they'd successfully banished. The first serious hailstorm, the first heavy snowfall settling on top of the whole structure, the first ominous crack, and suddenly that eternal pleasant afternoon becomes an enormous, extremely fragile problem suspended directly overhead. And the weather control fantasy carries a darker assumption that this era is simply too cheerful to sit with, which is that the climate is a simple machine with a handful of simple knobs, rather than a vast, deeply tangled system in which nudging one part sends consequences rippling unpredictably through every other part. The future imagines canceling the rain over the city without ever wondering what happens to the farmland just downwind that was actually counting on it. It pictures scheduling snow for the holidays as though the entire sky were a vending machine. It's mastery imagined without a shred of humility, control fantasized about without the faintest genuine grasp of the complexity actually being controlled. Your century inherits a far more sobering relationship with the weather, having learned the hard way that the climate isn't a thermostat and doesn't take requests. The dream of ordering up sunshine like a lunch delivery curdles slowly into the realization that the system was always considerably bigger than the dial, and that tampering with it tends to send the bill somewhere you never expected. The dome stayed a daydream, the weather stayed wild, and humanity stayed firmly outdoors, holding umbrellas. But if the future couldn't reach up and touch the sky, it had at least promised to let you reach out and touch each other across any distance, face to face, through the sheer miracle of a telephone that could actually let you see who was calling. Let's place a phone call, except in the future, you'll actually see the face of the person on the other end, beamed right back at you from a small screen built directly into the telephone. This is the picture phone, and it's presented as the very height of glamour. Everyone in the advertisements looks absolutely delighted to be seen, perfectly groomed, effortlessly smiling, camera-ready at every hour of the day. Nobody in 1958 has yet experienced the very specific dread of a video call arriving while you look, quite frankly, like something the cat dragged in, or the eternal unresolved question of exactly where you're supposed to be looking. They assume this will be elegant. They have no real idea what they're about to do to themselves. The picture phone is one of the predictions this era is most confident about, and for genuinely good reason, because the steady march of communication technology seems to point directly at it. First the telegraph, then the telephone, then television, each one pulling people a little closer together across ever greater distances. Adding a face to a phone call feels less like a wild leap of fantasy, and more like the obvious next rung on an already well-established ladder. So the future imagines it vividly. A sleek little screen mounted on every desk and every kitchen wall, face-to-face conversations conducted effortlessly across cities and entire continents, distance finally and gloriously defeated for good. The advertisements are a masterpiece of unintentional comedy, because absolutely everyone pictured in them is enjoying the single best possible version of this experience. The callers are immaculately groomed, perfectly lit, leaning eagerly toward the screen with radiant smiles, apparently thrilled beyond measure at both seeing and being seen. The picture phone gets sold as pure, effortless elegance, a glamorous technology built for glamorous people who seem to exist in a permanent, unwavering state of camera readiness, hair perfect, never once caught off guard by anything. It's a vision of video calling populated entirely by people who have somehow never once had a genuinely bad morning. What the glossy advertisements can't possibly foresee is the small, entirely human catastrophe waiting patiently on the other end of all that promised elegance. Your century knows the picture phone intimately, under a different name, the video call, and knows precisely what it actually feels like, which turns out to be nothing remotely glamorous. It's the mad scramble to look presentable the instant the call comes in. It's the specific horror of glimpsing your own tired face in the little corner window. It's the permanent, unresolved uncertainty over whether to look at the screen or the tiny camera lens, so that you spend the entire conversation appearing to gaze wistfully off over the other person's shoulder instead. The future delivered the picture phone right on schedule, and simply forgot to mention that hardly anyone would actually enjoy using it. The deeper miss here is one of feeling rather than function, the same miss this era makes over and over again. The future got the hardware almost exactly right. The screen, the face, the call spanning any distance you like. All of it real now, sitting comfortably in your pocket. What it could never picture was the strange, quiet exhaustion of it all. The way being visually seen during every single conversation turns out to be more of a burden than a gift. The way people would so often simply choose to leave the camera off entirely and go back to talking, retreating gratefully toward the plain old voice that the picture phone was supposedly built to improve upon. So the video phone arrived precisely as promised and was, a striking amount of the time, greeted with a polite request to please turn the camera off. It's one of the purest examples of this whole era's central blind spot, the deep assumption that more is always automatically better, that bolting a face onto a voice could only ever be an improvement and never once a complication. The glamour was entirely real. It just ran in one direction only, straight toward the camera, and never once accounted for the exhausted human being sitting right in front of it. And if the future was determined to fit a small screen onto your telephone, it was even more determined to fit an enormous one directly onto your living room wall. A television so vast it would stop being a mere piece of furniture and quietly become the room itself. Let's settle in for some evening entertainment, because the television of tomorrow has stopped being furniture altogether. It's now a wall. Picture an enormous flat screen stretching from corner to corner, so vivid and so overwhelmingly large that watching it genuinely feels like sitting in the front row of life itself. The whole family gathers before this glowing rectangle every single evening, hypnotized, content, barely blinking. And here's the strange part. This particular prediction turns out to be oddly, genuinely accurate, which is rare enough around here that we should probably savor it while it lasts. They got the giant flat screen exactly right. What they never once predicted is that you'd end up carrying a second, much smaller screen around in your hand and quietly staring down at that one instead, while the enormous wall-mounted screen talks on to an empty room. Television is brand new and genuinely electrifying in this era, a bulky wooden cabinet housing one small, round-cornered window into another world entirely. Faced with a marvel like this, the era naturally assumes it will only keep growing grander from here. The logic is sound enough. The picture gets bigger, the cabinet gets slimmer, and eventually the whole apparatus flattens down into one enormous panel mounted directly on the wall like a painting, except a painting that moves and talks and pulls the entire wide world directly into your living room. For once, this particular prediction isn't wishful nonsense at all. For once, this era is looking squarely down the correct road. The illustrations here are genuinely prophetic, families gathered before a vast flat screen filling an entire wall, the picture crisp and enormous, the whole room arranged around it like a small, private theater. They picture it becoming the true heart of the household, the place everyone gathers each evening to be informed and entertained together, faces all lit by the same glow, genuinely united in shared attention. And they turn out to be right about nearly every piece of it. The flat wall-mounted screen is real. It's probably sitting in the very room with you right now. The future, for once, actually delivered on the hardware. But here's the twist this era never once saw coming, the one that quietly turns the entire triumphant vision on its head. They pictured the giant screen commanding the family's complete, undivided attention, the same way the small, brand-new television of their own time was already commanding it. What actually happened is that the screen got everything it was ever promised: the size, the clarity, the place of honor mounted proudly on the wall, and then the family simply stopped looking at it. Because each individual person also quietly acquired a second screen along the way, small enough to hold in one hand, personal enough to disappear into entirely, and that's the one that ultimately won. The great glowing wall hangs there, narrating the evening to a room full of people staring silently down at their own hands. It's a strangely poignant failure hiding inside an otherwise total technical success, and it points directly at the one thing this era never quite grasped about its own dreams. They imagined technology drawing the family closer together, gathered in unified attention before one marvelous shared machine. They never once imagined technology fracturing that attention instead, splintering it into a dozen separate private little worlds, each person quietly alone with their own glowing rectangle while sitting in the very same shared room. The togetherness they pictured was genuinely real for a while, and then it simply, quietly dissolved, not because the big screen ever failed, but precisely because it succeeded, and then got upstaged entirely by something smaller and considerably more personal. So the wall-sized television stands as the rare prediction that came completely true and somehow still managed to miss the point, nailing the object perfectly while fumbling the meaning behind it entirely. This era understood correctly that screens would keep growing and multiplying and filling up every corner of daily life. It simply assumed all those screens would keep pointing everyone toward each other, when in practice, they so often end up pointing everyone quietly inward instead. They got the glass exactly right, and the people using it entirely wrong. But this era's faith in effortless living wasn't finished yet, because it still had one more piece of labor it fully intended to abolish, the oldest and most stubborn one of all, the simple, old-fashioned business of actually having to learn anything. It's time for bed, though not strictly speaking for rest, because the future has found a way to make even sleep productive. The idea, taken with total seriousness, is that you can genuinely learn while unconscious. Slip on a small device, let a recording play softly through the night, and wake up fluent in French, an expert in algebra, and apparently a slightly better person overall. No studying required. No real effort. Just lie there and absorb the knowledge like a damp sponge. School children of tomorrow, supposedly, will nap their way straight to genius. The dream here is that effort itself is finally about to become entirely optional. And like most dreams you happen to sleep through, this one doesn't fully survive the morning. Sleep learning is this era's ongoing convenience obsession, applied directly to the inside of your own skull. And it's genuinely irresistible precisely because real learning is genuinely hard. Studying takes hours, repetition, real frustration, the slow, grinding accumulation of knowledge against a tired and thoroughly unwilling brain. So the future does exactly what it always does whenever something proves difficult. It proposes to eliminate the effort entirely. Why struggle through an entire textbook when you could simply press play, drift comfortably off, and wake up transformed? It's the meal in a pill fantasy all over again, except this time the meal is education, and the pill is a quiet recorded voice murmuring facts at you while you snore. The vision is undeniably tidy, a recording of whatever subject you'd like to know, played softly beside the bed all night long, gently seeping into your sleeping mind and lodging there permanently. Entire languages absorbed over a single week of naps. Whole academic subjects mastered somewhere between dusk and dawn. The children of tomorrow drift off each night to a gentle recorded lecture and wake up comfortably ahead of their classmates, having learned an entire lesson during the very hours they spent dreaming. School itself might eventually shrink down to little more than a comfortable bed and a well-chosen playlist. The universal childhood misery of actual studying, simply switched quietly off. The trouble the dream sails straight past is that a sleeping brain isn't actually sitting there idle, patiently available for a nightly download. It's extremely busy the whole time, doing its own essential work, sorting, filing, repairing, and it is very much not in the market for new lectures on top of all that. The mind doesn't soak up fresh facts from a disembodied voice in the dark, the way a sponge soaks up water, because the mind, it turns out, is not actually a sponge. It's a fussy, particular organ that learns specifically through attention and effort and genuine wakefulness. You cannot pour knowledge into an unconscious person any more than you could feed them a proper dinner while they slept. Though give this particular era another minute, and it would probably try that one too. What makes the sleep learning dream so revealing is the wish quietly sitting underneath it, the exact same wish animating the jetpack and the meal pill and the tireless robot maid. The deep, recurring yearning to receive the reward without ever doing the actual work. This era keeps circling right back to that same fantasy from every conceivable angle, the belief that effort itself is nothing more than an obstacle, a design flaw in human life simply waiting to be patched out by sufficiently clever machinery. It never seriously entertains the far more uncomfortable possibility that the effort is actually woven directly into the value. That knowledge earned through genuine struggle is the only kind that reliably sticks, that anything absorbed entirely without work tends to be worth exactly what you paid for it. So sleep learning quietly joins the long parade of magnificent shortcuts leading absolutely nowhere. The gadgets and elaborate schemes designed to deliver full mastery without ever requiring the inconvenient business of actually mastering anything. Your own century still flirts occasionally with the ghost of it, the audio lesson playing hopefully in the background, the persistent belief that you might absorb a new language through mere proximity alone. And it works about as well now as it ever did, which is to say, not remotely at all. The brain, stubbornly, insists on being awake and present for its own education. But this era's faith in painless miracles was about to face a considerably more serious test, in an arena far more consequential than the classroom, because it had already decided that the very same ingredient powering its cars and its homes would now go on to cure every illness known to medicine. Let's talk about your health, which the future intends to manage using precisely the same ingredient it uses for absolutely everything else: radiation. The very atom powering your car and your household appliances will now also mend broken bones, cure disease, and presumably whiten your teeth while it's at it. The doctors of tomorrow speak with total confidence about zapping illness clean out of existence, about a world entirely without sickness, about medicine so far advanced that the common cold becomes little more than a quaint historical footnote. The optimism here is enormous, and it's genuinely sincere. The caution, unfortunately, is running noticeably behind schedule, a recurring theme, it turns out, whenever this era gets excited about the word atomic. The atom has already proven itself the true miracle of the age, so naturally medicine wants a piece of the action, and the predictions pour out with all the confidence of people who have already watched one impossible thing after another come true right on schedule. Radiation will supposedly hunt disease down wherever it happens to be hiding. Atomic energy will rebuild damaged bodies from the inside out. The grand promise on offer is nothing less than the total end of illness itself, a future where the doctor wields the single most powerful force in the known universe like a magic wand, and sickness simply ceases to be a meaningful feature of human existence. It's the exact same boundless faith that put a reactor in the family sedan, now aimed squarely at the human body instead. And it's genuinely worth saying, this is the one arena where the underlying instinct isn't entirely foolish, where the atom really does have something worthwhile to eventually offer. This era turns out to be correct that radiation will become a real, meaningful tool in medicine. Correct that it will be deployed against certain diseases with genuine, lasting success. Correct that the careful application of these forces really will go on to save lives. There's a true breakthrough buried somewhere in here, which makes this particular prediction considerably more interesting than the flying car, because it isn't wrong about the destination at all. It's only wildly, dangerously wrong about the dosage, because the missing ingredient, as always, is caution. And when it comes to radiation specifically, the absence of caution stops being a punchline and becomes a genuine hazard. The very same era dreaming of atomic cures hasn't yet fully reckoned with the uncomfortable fact that this miracle force is every bit as capable of causing the illnesses it promises to defeat. The enthusiasm here runs miles ahead of the actual understanding. Radiation gets sprinkled liberally into the medicine of tomorrow, the exact same way the word atomic gets slapped onto a box of breakfast cereal. A cheerful badge of progress, with nowhere near enough attention paid to the small detail that a genuinely powerful force is, by definition, powerful and entirely indifferent to whether it happens to heal you or harm you. This is the recurring shape of this whole era's relationship with the atom. The breathless excitement always arriving well before the wisdom does. The marvel embraced enthusiastically long before the danger has been properly mapped out. The future imagines radiation as a friendly genie that only ever does good, when in truth it's a tool of extraordinary power demanding extraordinary respect, precision, and restraint in equal measure. The dream of zapping every disease into oblivion skips right past the slow, careful, unglamorous work of learning exactly how much, exactly where, and exactly when, which turns out to be the entire difference between practicing medicine and causing genuine harm. So atomic medicine does eventually arrive, but soberly, in carefully measured doses, administered by careful hands that learned the actual limits this era was simply too giddy to imagine in advance. The fantasy of a world entirely without sickness gives way to the real, considerably more modest achievement of a handful of specific diseases met with one powerful new weapon, used with exactly the caution 1958 forgot to pack. The genie turns out to be entirely real. The genie also turns out to be nothing you'd ever want to trifle with. But of all this era's predictions, the one that stings the most in hindsight isn't really about machines or medicine at all. It's about you, specifically, about how you were supposed to be spending your days, once the machines had finally, truly set you free. Here's the best prediction of the entire bunch, and the one you're most likely to genuinely mourn. The consensus across the board is that the future will be a paradise of leisure. Machines and robots will handle essentially all the labor, leaving the average worker putting in perhaps 20 hours a week, maybe fewer, with the rest of life devoted to hobbies, picnics, and gentle self-improvement. The great looming worry of tomorrow, they warn with genuine concern, will be boredom, not unpaid bills. Not burnout, not answering work emails at midnight from bed. Boredom. Try, for a moment, to imagine being so completely certain that automation was about to set you free, and then imagine the look on their faces if you told them the machines showed up exactly as promised, and you somehow ended up busier than ever. The reasoning behind the leisure dream is so clean, so logically sound, that it's genuinely hard to spot the flaw at first glance. It goes like this: machines do work. Better machines do more work. Therefore, as the machines keep improving, there's steadily less work left over for actual people to do, and the hours shrink, and the leisure time grows, until eventually humanity is fully liberated from toil and free to simply enjoy itself. Every step follows logically from the one before it. The thinkers of this era draw that line forward with total confidence and arrive squarely at a future of long weekends, short workdays, and the strange, almost enviable problem of having too much free time on your hands. And they genuinely, sincerely worried about that free time, which is the part that quietly breaks your heart a little, in hindsight. Serious people wrote serious essays fretting over what the population would possibly do with all that idle time, how society would cope with the great looming challenge of leisure, whether people might grow restless and aimless with so little actually required of them. They pictured education programs specifically designed to help ordinary citizens enjoy their newfound abundance of time off. They imagined an entire nation of hobbyists, painting, fishing, quietly improving their minds, the work week reduced to a brief, almost quaint formality, the rest of life stretching out ahead like one long, pleasant afternoon. The danger they genuinely worried about looking ahead was idleness. You already know exactly how this one ends because you're currently living inside the punchline. The machines did come. They arrived precisely as promised and considerably more capable than anyone back then dared to imagine, automating task after task, quietly doing the work of dozens of people at once. The labor-saving miracle delivered completely, in full, and the leisure simply never showed up. The hours never shrank. Somehow, each new machine that saved time also generated fresh new demands to fill that exact same space. New work to do. New obligations to keep up with, until the average person today stands surrounded by labor-saving devices on every side and has never once in their entire life felt more genuinely pressed for time. The productivity clearly went somewhere. It just never quite made it back to you. This might be the cruelest trick the future ever played, and it's worth understanding precisely why the prediction failed, because it didn't fail on the technology at all. The machines held up their entire end of the bargain completely. What this era simply couldn't foresee is that the time saved by automation wouldn't get handed back to the worker as genuine leisure. It would instead get absorbed, reinvested, quietly demanded back as yet more output. They assumed the whole point of progress was to free people from work. They never once considered that the work itself might simply expand to swallow whatever extra room the machines happened to open up, that the finish line would keep moving exactly as fast as anyone ran toward it. So the leisure society remains the great unkept promise, the most reasonable prediction of the entire era, the most carefully argued, and in the end, the most thoroughly betrayed. The picnic never came. The 20-hour work week never came. The boredom everyone so kindly worried about on your behalf never got the chance to show up either. Buried under 1,000 fresh obligations, the machines somehow generated instead of quietly removing. And that same hopefulness, that same total conviction that everything was about to become easy and bright and effortless, shaped the very streets this era imagined you'd eventually be living on. The gleaming, orderly, endlessly climate-controlled suburb of tomorrow. Let's take a walk through your future neighborhood, a tidy circle of identical homes, arranged with the loving precision of a wedding cake. Every lawn is a uniform, flawless green. Every roof carries the same gentle curve. Every driveway holds a gleaming vehicle that may or may not, depending on the year, actually fly. The whole development is climate-controlled, entirely crime-free, and relentlessly, aggressively cheerful, a place where nothing ever goes wrong, purely because the brochure has decided in advance that it won't. The future suburb, it turns out, has thought of nearly everything except for one small detail: actual people, who stubbornly insist on being messy, unpredictable, and prone to parking directly on the lawn. But that apparently is tomorrow's problem, and tomorrow, as always, is scheduled to be perfect. The suburb of tomorrow is where every single one of this era's separate daydreams finally converge into one master plan for how life is actually meant to be lived. Here's the plastic house. Here's the push-button kitchen. Here's the robot maid, the flying car parked in the driveway, the wall-sized television glowing warmly in every living room, all of it assembled together into one complete, tidy little community, planned down to the very last curve of the very last cul-de-sac. It's an entire neighborhood designed the way you might design a piece of machinery, with every component in its proper place and every function carefully accounted for. Nothing at all is left to chance, because chance, by definition, is messy, and this particular future has no patience whatsoever for mess. The illustrations are immaculate and genuinely a little eerie in just how complete that perfection is. The homes stand identical and gleaming, arranged in neat geometric patterns around carefully shared green spaces. The lawns are uniformly, suspiciously emerald. The skis overhead are uniformly, suspiciously blue. The residents, wherever you happen to catch a glimpse of them, look uniformly, suspiciously content, strolling around in their leisure clothes, enjoying their supposedly abundant free time, untroubled by literally anything at all. It's a vision of order so complete it loops back around into something faintly unsettling. A community with every scrap of friction carefully sanded off, every rough edge deliberately removed, every ounce of unpredictability engineered out well in advance. And that's precisely where the perfect suburb runs aground on the one variable it could never quite design away, the actual people who'd have to go on living inside it. People, it turns out, are not tidy. They refuse to stay neatly within their assigned patterns. They paint their houses the wrong color out of pure stubbornness. They let their lawns go brown out of simple neglect. They park on the grass. They argue loudly with their neighbors over the fence line. They introduce, in every conceivable way, exactly the kind of glorious disorder the master plan was specifically engineered to prevent from ever happening. You can carefully engineer the streets, and the housing, and even the local climate, but you cannot, it turns out, engineer the residents themselves into the same smooth, contented figures drawn so confidently in the illustration. Because real people arrive carrying real opinions, real bad days, and a deep, stubborn instinct to do things their own particular way regardless of the master plan. The deeper flaw running through the entire perfect suburb is that it quietly confuses orderliness with genuine happiness, smoothness with the good life itself, as though the whole point of building a community were to eliminate every possible problem rather than to build somewhere genuinely worth living. The brochure promises a neighborhood where nothing ever goes wrong. But a place where nothing ever goes wrong is also, almost by definition, a place where nothing much ever happens either, sterile, overmanaged, and quietly a little lifeless underneath all the polish. This era keeps making precisely the same mistake at every scale it operates on, mistaking the mere absence of trouble for the actual presence of joy, imagining that if you could simply strip out every last imperfection, what remained afterward would naturally be paradise, rather than a very clean, very quiet waiting room. Your own century inherited later versions of this exact dream, the planned community, the perfectly arranged suburban development, and slowly learned that the messiness isn't some flaw in the original design at all. It's the actual substance of human life. It's the thing that makes a neighborhood feel like a genuine neighborhood, rather than a diagram brought to life. But the most revealing thing about all these gleaming visions of tomorrow isn't really where they went wrong. It's how thoroughly, stubbornly they managed to stay exactly the same underneath all the surface chrome, which is precisely where we're headed next. Let's go down, all the way down, because if the land ever gets too crowded, this era already has a backup plan, and that plan is to move to the bottom of the ocean. Picture entire cities built from glass domes resting quietly on the seabed. Families waving cheerfully at passing fish, children riding trained dolphins on their way to school each morning. You'll live underwater, work underwater, and take your vacations, presumably, only slightly farther underwater than usual. It's all presented with total seriousness, as though relocating a meaningful chunk of humanity to the crushing cold darkness of the deep sea were merely a matter of hearing the right contractor. Everyone in the illustrations looks thoroughly enchanted. Nobody mentions the small, inconvenient detail that the entire city is, technically, precisely one cracked window away from an extremely bad afternoon for everyone involved. The undersea city springs from the exact same arithmetic that gave us the seaweed dinner, genuine worry over a booming population steadily running out of room on dry land. But where farming the sea was purely about food, this particular dream goes considerably further, proposing that people themselves should simply relocate down there and take up permanent residence on the ocean floor. The sea covers most of the planet's entire surface. The reasoning goes, so why keep crowding onto the comparatively tiny sliver of dry land remaining, when there's all that space below, waiting patiently and empty, and only mildly interested in killing you at every single moment? The illustrations here are spectacular and genuinely committed to the bit. Gleaming domes cluster together across the seabed, connected by long illuminated tubes, families inside going about perfectly ordinary lives at perfectly extraordinary depths. There are pictures of children commuting to school on the backs of trained dolphins, as though the dolphin were simply this era's answer to the ordinary school bus. There are undersea farms, undersea factories, undersea living rooms with picture windows framing the passing fish outside. The entire concept gets rendered with the cheerful confidence of a real estate listing, the deadly, crushing ocean reduced to nothing more than a charming scenic view. What the listing conveniently leaves out, naturally, is the relentless and genuinely unforgiving hostility of the actual environment in question. The deep sea is cold and dark and crushingly, unimaginably heavy, a place where the surrounding water presses inward with enough sheer force to fold solid steel, where there's no breathable air, no natural warmth, and absolutely no second chances if something goes wrong. That charming glass dome with the lovely ocean view also happens to be the single thin barrier standing between the happy family inside and an environment that would very much like to flatten them instantly given half a chance. A single crack, one structural failure, and that charming undersea living room becomes a problem with no good ending whatsoever. The future pictures the dolphins vividly. It somehow never quite gets around to picturing the water pressure. This is this era's optimism in its purest, most reckless possible form, the deep belief that any environment on Earth, no matter how genuinely lethal, is really nothing more than a construction challenge patiently waiting to be cheerfully overcome. It treats relocating to the bottom of the sea as roughly equivalent to relocating to the suburbs, simply a matter of building the right kind of houses and installing the right amenities. It cannot quite imagine that some places are hostile not because nobody's tried hard enough yet, but because they are fundamentally, permanently unsuited to soft, warm, air-breathing creatures who would generally prefer not to be crushed. So the undersea city stays exactly where it lives, safely inside the illustrations, admired at length, and never once actually inhabited, joining the long gallery of tomorrows that looked absolutely magnificent on paper and simply ignored every relevant piece of fine print. Humanity does eventually venture beneath the waves, in submarines and careful research stations and brief, cautious visits, but it never truly moves in down there, never raises children on the ocean floor, never sends anyone off to school on the back of a dolphin. The sea remains, to this day, a place to visit rather than a place to actually live, and the domed cities stay exactly what they always were, dry daydreams. But if the deep ocean below proved a little too hostile to genuinely conquer, this era had its eye fixed on somewhere even more forbidding still, and it pointed that ambition straight upward, utterly convinced that within a single generation you'd be packing your bags for the moon. Now look up, because the future has absolutely no intention of staying on Earth, and neither, apparently, do you. By the year 2000, everyone seems entirely certain there will be thriving, fully functioning cities on the moon, complete with schools, shops, and tidy little domed neighborhoods where children bounce gently across the low-gravity playground on their way to recess. The moon gets treated less like a hostile, airless rock, and considerably more like a promising new suburb with a slightly longer-than-average commute. There are detailed, loving paintings of cozy lunar living rooms, complete with picture windows facing straight out into the stars. The confidence on display is total. The plumbing, the air supply, and almost as an afterthought, the small matter of actually getting there in the first place are simply details somebody else can sort out later. The moon colony represents this era's entire faith in progress, aimed directly at the sky, and the confidence underneath it is genuinely staggering, precisely because the actual timeline seems to be racing along so quickly. Rockets are real now. The space age has quite visibly begun, and the same trend line that put airplanes absolutely everywhere within a single lifetime is simply being extended straight onward, this time toward the moon and beyond it. If you can build a machine that flies, the reasoning goes, you can eventually build one that flies high enough, and once you're actually up there, the rest is really just a matter of unpacking. By the turn of the century, this era is entirely confident. The moon will be settled, thoroughly ordinary, dotted with the exact same tidy domed neighborhoods you'd find literally anywhere else. And the imagined lunar lifestyle is charmingly, revealingly domestic. The paintings show families relaxing in cozy living rooms behind enormous picture windows, the starry void just outside treated casually as a lovely scenic view rather than a genuinely lethal vacuum. Children bound happily to school in the reduced gravity. There are lunar shops, lunar playgrounds, entire lunar suburbs, the whole comfortable apparatus of ordinary earthly life, simply transplanted wholesale onto the surface of the moon, and carrying on as though nothing particularly unusual had happened along the way. The moon becomes, in this imagining, less a genuine frontier and more a new subdivision across town, the commute merely a touch longer than the average person is used to. The hand-waving, as always in this era, happens precisely around the parts that are actually difficult, which, on the moon, turns out to be essentially everything. The air you'd need just to breathe, the water you'd need to drink, the food, the warmth, the shielding required against a sun no longer politely filtered by any atmosphere, the sheer, staggering difficulty and cost of hauling anything at all up there in the first place. These are the real obstacles, and they're precisely the ones the cheerful illustrations glide straight past. The picture window frames the stars beautifully, and never once dwells on the small detail that the other side of that glass is a place that would kill you within seconds. This is this era's signature move, performed here at its absolute grandest scale. The gorgeous, loving rendering of the final destination, paired with a confident shrug at the actual journey, and the engineering required to get there. They could picture the lunar living room down to the curtains long before anyone could reasonably picture how to keep a single human being alive inside it. The dream lives entirely in the arrival, in the smiling family already comfortably settled in, and skips lightly over the decades of brutal, expensive, genuinely dangerous work that actually standing on the moon would require, let alone building a life there. Humanity really did reach the moon in one of the genuine, hard-won triumphs of this whole era, and it turned out to be every bit as forbidding as the illustrations had quietly declined to admit, a place visited briefly by a small handful of people at enormous cost and effort, and then, for a long while afterward, largely left alone. The tidy lunar suburbs promised for the year 2000 never materialized. The children never bounced their way to a lunar playground. The moon remained, in the end, a destination rather than an actual address. But settling the moon was, in this era's mind, really just the warm-up act, because once you had a foothold up there, the obvious next step was to start planning a relaxing family holiday to Mars. Let's plan a holiday, because once the moon is comfortably settled, the natural next step is apparently a pleasant family trip to Mars. The travel brochures of tomorrow depict rockets boarding passengers like ordinary trains, with smiling vacationers in matching outfits waving cheerfully from the windows. You'll pack a suitcase, say goodbye to the Robot Maid, and rocket off to the Red Planet for a relaxing 2-week holiday among the famous canals everyone is quite confident are waiting up there. The actual journey, which in reality takes many months of cramped, genuinely perilous, bone-thinning travel, gets pictured as roughly the same inconvenience as a longish drive out to visit relatives. This era does not do small dreams. The Mars vacation represents this era's optimism finally reaching escape velocity, the exact point where the confident line drawn into the future simply leaves the page entirely. If the moon is destined to become a suburb, then Mars is destined to become the exotic getaway of tomorrow, and the entire imagining of it borrows wholesale from the established glamour of travel as this era already understands it. Spaceflight gets pictured as merely a more thrilling version of taking the train, all clean lines, smiling attendants, and passengers in perfectly coordinated outfits gazing happily out the window as the stars slide gently past. It's tourism, simply relocated out to the solar system. The brochures, both the real ones and the imagined ones, are a genuine delight of misplaced confidence. Rockets board their passengers with the calm, practiced efficiency of a busy railway platform. Families pose cheerfully for photographs before departure, luggage in hand, dressed for an adventure presented as no more demanding than an ordinary trip to the seaside. And the destination itself arrives preloaded with wonders this era is entirely confident are waiting there for them. Chief among them, the famous canals of Mars, those mysterious lines everyone assumes to be the deliberate handiwork of some Martian civilization, ready and waiting to be admired by tourists armed with cameras. You'll go. You'll sightsee. You'll come home tanned and thoroughly refreshed. The reality of actual interplanetary travel, which the brochure understandably declines to print, is considerably less relaxing than advertised. The journey to Mars isn't a pleasant afternoon excursion at all, but a genuinely grueling expedition lasting many months, spent sealed inside a cramped capsule, bathed continuously in radiation, while the human body itself steadily weakens in the near-total absence of proper gravity, bones thinning, muscles quietly wasting away. It is dangerous. It is exhausting, and it sits about as far from a relaxing 2-week holiday as any human experience could possibly get. And the famous canals, so eagerly anticipated by everyone back home, turn out not to be there at all, a trick of distance and hopeful eyes, leaving the red planet considerably less charming, in practice, than any of the travel posters ever promised. This is this whole era's personality distilled down into one single, absurd, genuinely lovable image. The family in matching outfits, cheerfully waving goodbye for their casual jaunt out to another world entirely. It captures absolutely everything. The boundless confidence, the flat refusal to dwell on genuine difficulty, the deep instinct to take something wondrous and immediately make it feel cozy and domestic and easy. This era simply cannot conceive of a dream too large for it to hold, and it cannot conceive of dressing that dream in anything other than the comfortable, familiar clothing of an ordinary holiday brochure. Mars isn't some deadly frontier sitting millions of miles away. Mars is where you're taking the kids next summer. The Mars vacation, of course, never actually arrived, and the journey remains to this day the exclusive realm of careful, painstaking planning and enormous technical difficulty, rather than coordinated matching outfits and cheerful waving from a departure window. The canals were never real to begin with. The fortnight was never going to be relaxing, and the red planet stayed exactly, stubbornly out of reach of the ordinary family suitcase. But step back now, for a moment, from all of it, from the moon suburbs and the Mars holidays and the undersea domes, and look at this entire gleaming parade of tomorrows together, all at once, because there's something hiding in plain sight running underneath every single one of them. Something that quietly gives the whole dream away. Here's the strange part, the thing that gives the entire glittering dream away completely. For all the rockets and all the robots and all the atomic miracles on offer, the future this era imagined looked oddly, stubbornly, almost defiantly familiar underneath it all. In every single painting, Father still strides purposefully off to the office, even if he happens to be wearing a jetpack to get there. Mother still tends quietly to the home, even with a fully capable robot standing right there doing the actual physical work. The neat lawns, the tidy rolls, the gentle, unquestioned conformity of 1958 all simply get launched wholesale into outer space and handed a flying car on the way out the door. This era could picture an entire functioning colony on the moon far more easily than it could picture a single genuine change happening down here, on solid ground. Once you notice this particular pattern, you genuinely cannot stop noticing it, this peculiar, persistent failure of imagination running quietly underneath all that dazzling hardware. This era could dream up the wildest machines imaginable, the boldest possible journeys, the most fantastical transformations of every single object in daily life. And yet it couldn't budge even a single inch on how that life was actually supposed to be arranged day to day. The future, as imagined here, is a place full of atomic sedans and lunar suburbs, populated entirely by people behaving exactly as they already did back in 1958. The technology raced 1,000 years ahead of schedule, while the society it was meant to serve stayed completely frozen in place, exactly where it had always stood. Look again at any one of those gleaming illustrations, and the pattern jumps straight out at you. Father, in the home of tomorrow, still puts on a proper suit and heads dutifully off to work, the only real difference being the rocket now strapped conspicuously to his back, or the flying car parked out in the driveway. Mother, in the kitchen of tomorrow, still stands faithfully at the counter managing the entire household, even as a fully capable robot maid hovers nearby, theoretically handling all the actual lifting. The children, the lawns, the neat, unquestioned division of who does what and who belongs precisely where all of it sails through completely untouched into the imagined future, picked up whole from the present day, and simply set back down again, amid all the chrome and the stars. It's a genuinely revealing kind of blindness, because it shows you the real difference between imagining new objects and imagining an entirely new world. Inventing a flying car is comparatively easy, in a sense, because you're really only taking something that already exists and bolting on one marvelous new feature. Imagining that the people riding inside that flying car might actually live differently, that the whole shape of their days, their roles, their relationships might genuinely transform, that's the considerably harder act, and it's the one this era could almost never quite manage. They reached the moon inside their own imaginations with total ease. They could not somehow reach a genuinely different arrangement of ordinary daily life that was sitting right there in front of them the entire time. And this is the deeper truth the whole exercise ultimately reveals about predicting the future, a truth that applies just as forcefully to your own era's confident forecasts as it did to theirs. People tend to imagine tomorrow by simply decorating today. They take the present moment, the one world they genuinely, actually know, and they bolt gadgets onto it, and then they call the finished result the future. The genuinely transformative changes, the ones that actually reshape not the objects around us but the lives lived among them, tend to arrive quietly, unannounced, from directions nobody was even looking in, precisely because everyone was too busy carefully painting jetpacks onto a world that, underneath it all, was staying exactly the same. So the future of 1958 turns out to be, in the end, a kind of mirror held up to 1958 itself, its hopes, its assumptions, and its blind spots, all carefully preserved in chrome and launched skyward. The rockets tell you what they genuinely wanted. The unchanged living rooms tell you what they simply could not see. It's the single most human thing in this entire gallery of predictions. This deep inability to imagine that the truly profound changes might come not to the machines at all, but to the people using them. And yet, for all the dreams that missed the mark, for all the jetpacks that never once got off the ground, a small handful of these predictions did come quietly, humbly true. In ways stranger and considerably more modest than anyone ever painted. Before we close the book entirely on all this glorious wrongness, let's be fair to them, because 1958 wasn't mistaken about absolutely everything. Some of it really did arrive, almost exactly as promised, just with a great deal less chrome and considerably worse posture. It would be genuinely unfair to spend this entire night laughing at the misses without tipping our hat at least briefly to the hits. And there are more of them than you might expect. That giant wall-mounted television, dismissed earlier as a rare lucky guess, is sitting in your living room right now, flat and enormous, exactly as predicted decades in advance. The picture phone, so impossibly glamorous in those old advertisements, quietly connects faces across entire continents every single day of your life. This era genuinely looked down certain roads and saw correctly exactly where they led, even while getting almost everything about the actual journey completely wrong. The single biggest hit of all is the one this era never quite managed to name outright, but kept circling back toward, again and again. The small device that does absolutely everything. They imagined it arriving in pieces, scattered across a dozen separate gadgets. The phone over here, the television over there, the encyclopedia somewhere else entirely, never once dreaming that all of it would eventually collapse down into a single slab of glass, small enough to slip comfortably into a pocket. The object sitting in your hand right now genuinely is the picture phone, and the wall-sized television, and an entire library, and a detailed map, and a camera, and 100 other separately promised marvels, all folded together seamlessly into one object this era could never quite picture clearly, yet somehow absolutely saw coming anyway. What they consistently got wrong, though even about the predictions they nailed completely, was the actual feeling of it all. They imagined the future would feel like a genuine triumph, gleaming and effortless and quietly proud, that living among these marvels would mean standing tall, lifted up by progress into a brighter, considerably more dignified way of simply being. They pictured the citizen of tomorrow standing confidently amid all these wonders, effortless and thoroughly content. They never once imagined that you'd end up holding the single most miraculous device in the entire history of human invention at arm's length in the dark, slightly hunched over, using it mainly to fall asleep to a stranger's calm voice describing exactly how wrong everybody used to be. Because that's the quiet joke sitting right at the heart of the whole thing, the gap this era could never have possibly measured in advance. The marvels really did arrive, and a genuinely surprising number of them arrived more or less as advertised. The flat screen, the video call, the everything machine, the little robot that dutifully cleans your floor, all delivered in full. But none of it transformed daily life into the proud, effortless paradise from the illustrations. Instead, it all quietly wove itself into the fabric of ordinary existence, into the late nights, the everyday tiredness, the small daily comforts, until even the most extraordinary tools ever imagined simply became the unremarkable furniture of one perfectly ordinary, perfectly human evening. And maybe that's the gentlest lesson the future of the past has left behind for us. That genuine wonder doesn't announce itself the way the brochures always promised it would. The miracles arrive, and then, almost immediately, they become normal, and then they quietly become the thing you barely even notice anymore while you're drifting off to sleep. The people of 1958 were entirely right that astonishing things were genuinely on their way. They just missed one small detail. That astonishment, it turns out, has a remarkably short shelf life. That today's miracle is simply tomorrow's background humming along quietly, mostly unnoticed in the dark. So there you have it, an entire generation absolutely certain that tomorrow would arrive gleaming, atomic, and completely effortless. They promised you a flying car and quietly handed you traffic instead. They promised a robot maid and delivered a small, perpetually confused disk that gets stuck under the couch. They promised dinner in a pill, endless leisure, a shining silver suit, a holiday out on Mars, and a future so effortless that boredom would become your single biggest worry. And here you are instead, awake far too late, doing your own dishes by hand, gloriously and stubbornly busy. But be gentle with them tonight because they weren't foolish, not really. They had simply watched the impossible happen so many times in a row that they genuinely couldn't picture it ever stopping. They looked out at a hard, uncertain world and chose, with their whole hearts, to believe it was on the very edge of becoming wonderful. There's something quietly brave in that, something that deserves a soft smile rather than a laugh at their expense. And some of it, remember, really did come true. The screen on the wall. The face on the call. The little everything machine resting quietly in your hand right now. The marvels did arrive, just considerably quieter and humbler than the brochures ever swore they'd be, settling gradually into ordinary life until you stopped noticing them at all. That may be the truest thing the dreamers of 1958 never quite managed to guess. That wonder, once it finally shows up, simply becomes Tuesday. So tonight, as you set down that small, miraculous glowing rectangle and let your eyes finally fall shut, maybe spare a soft thought for the people who first imagined you. They pictured you living like royalty among the stars. They would be genuinely amazed to learn that you got most of the actual magic, used it well, and in the end simply drifted off to a calm voice in the dark. Sleep well. The future turned out fine.